so many people are like, oh, politics, right? Like, we don't want to play politics. Like, it's a bad thing, like, especially in startup tech culture. People just kind of want to pretend like it doesn't happen and everything's a meritocracy. In reality, that's not true.
That's Yui Zhao. Yui is a former product executive turned executive coach. She specifically helps women and minority leaders break through to the C-suite, which is an amazing mission. And Yui's the real deal. She was Chief Product and Technology Officer at Fuzzy Health. She was a PM manager at Meta and Instagram. She was the first PM and part of the early team at Thumbtack. She's been a VC-backed founder herself. She's a partner at LifeX Ventures. She has an MBA from Harvard. Her accolades are insane. If you're new here, I'm Andrew, and this is a show where I get to have candid conversations with amazing people like Yui about some of the toughest moments in their careers and explore what they learned from them, what they would do differently if they could go back in time. It's enough from me. Let's jump right in and hear Yui's story.
I was born in Nanjing in China. It's a small city outside of Shanghai, about an hour by train. It's a couple million people, and that's where I grew up. So I spent a good first 10 years of my life there, and then moved to the US, to the Bay Area, and then spent most of my formative years, went to undergrad at Berkeley, and so pretty much consider myself Californian. If I go anywhere in the world, if I meet people from other places, they pretty much pin me as a California person. And so, they always ask me where I'm from. I say California, and that's usually the end of the question. And so, yeah, that's what my childhood was like. It was kind of split between the two areas, large metropolitan city in China, and then sort of the Bay Area with its upcoming tech scene. My parents worked in tech, but very much, grew up in the suburbia version of that life.
Cool. What did your parents do?
My father was an electrical engineer, and my mom was a television broadcaster in China. And then when she moved to the US, she spent a bit of time just caretaking me. I was a troublesome kid. And then eventually she became a technician for a fiber optics company. So she would calibrate these like giant fiber optic machines and sometimes come back with like stuff randomly burnt on her lab coat. And I'm like, are you okay? Is this a safe job? But she very much enjoyed it. And yeah, they spent most of their working years just the good sort of classic, American citizen model minority type people. Like I would just point at them and be like, yep, classic sort of definition of that.
And so what are you into as a kid? I mean, you said you're a troublesome kid. I don't know if you're joking there or not. If you are a troublesome kid, I'd love to know what trouble sounds like in your definition.
Sure.
And then two, when you weren't getting into trouble, what were you into? Like were you into sports? Were you into clubs? Did you have little businesses that you started? Help us to understand a little bit more of who you are.
So I had the classic tiger mom as my parents. And so I
just learned about this term recently. Can you share what that... Yeah, I just learned about it because I've got a 4-year-old, and so he's just entering the school systems. And so one of the other parents shared this with me. So for folks who are like me that don't know or didn't know until recently what that means, can you share? Mm-hmm. Can you enlighten us?
Yeah, so tiger mom is a phrase that I think most generally addresses Asian parents who were overly prescriptive about what their kids did. They were very much overseeing all of their kids' interests, where they went to school, who they were friends with, what they did in their free time. And they very much kind of were in it with the kids, right? Every step of the way. So, for example, I played piano, very classically Asian hobby. My mom sat with me through most of my practices, on my recitals, recorded the teacher, would do research on like the various things. So they're really in the parenting with the kid and also just very high expectations of the outcome of that. And so I would say that as a kid, and still very much so now, I had a very wide set of interests. So there were things that my parents wanted me to learn, like piano, which I did. And then there were things that I wanted to learn. Like I played badminton in high school, and then in college, I watched a lot of anime and played a lot of video games. So I kind of hung out in high school with the nerdy crowd, I guess. I learned Japanese, I played video games, didn't really get into quote unquote like trouble. And so when I went to college, that was a bit of a let's get into trouble moment since I had left home. And so that was really when I tried I went to Berkeley undergrad. So tried a bunch of things, tried a bunch of questionable things, and then eventually settled down a bit by my junior year to like graduate on time. But as you'll probably, hopefully, maybe we'll get to in my career, it is often just a combination of things that I like in the moment that I sort of chase after and see what it becomes. And I think that very much started in my college days. And I think my upbringing very much contributed to me not knowing what I wanted going into college and then sort of shaping this path that is, let me figure out what are all these different pieces that I like and don't like, put them together and figure out, what I want to do with it.
And do you think because your parents, or at least your mom in the example that you were sharing, was so involved in some of your activities growing up, do you think that led to this moment where you got to college where you're just like, fuck it, I'm just going to let it rip and like do what I want to do. And then at some point you kind of figure out what that is. Like, is that part of that? It's like this kind of breaking free of the old version of you and learning who you are?
I think for sure, but I probably wasn't so reckless in what I did because I think the countervailing force to that is we were very much a working, quote unquote, middle class family. Like there wasn't a ton for me to go back on. I paid my own tuitions and, my own expenses through college. And so, I had to feed myself and stay in school. Yeah. And that was kind of the bar. And then, on the other hand, there was definitely I took philosophy classes, tried hip hop dancing, tried various questionable drinks and foods in school. And so it was definitely a like, let me explore, let me figure out what I liked. And I think part of it was also me finding that I like a very wide variety of things. Like I wasn't someone where, there was one thing and I became obsessed with it and that's all I could think about day in, day out. I was someone who actually very much thrived on 10 different things happening at the same time. And then I think the other thing that I learned around that time was that I was actually relatively good at socializing with the vast different types of people. So like in high school, as I mentioned, I played video games, watched anime, hung out with the nerdy kids. But in college, I actually very much hung out with a lot of different groups of people. And so I eventually ended up in a career in product, but that was kind of the first time where I was like, hey, I don't find it as difficult as I thought to get along with a broad spectrum of people with a very broad set of interests.
This episode of the show is brought to you by one of my favorite products, Fullstory. When I led the growth team at Wistia, we spent a ton of time optimizing our new user onboarding experience. We ran experiment after experiment to improve our activation flow, but after a while, we felt like we plateaued a little bit until we started something that completely changed everything, which we called Fullstory Fridays. Every Friday, we'd fire up Fullstory and we'd watch 20 to 30 real users go through our product for the very first time. And it was painful. We saw people get lost. We saw them get stuck. We saw rage clicking on unclickable elements. One time we had a user get 3 pop-ups at the exact same time, which our engineer hated. But those sessions completely changed how we worked as a team. Instead of guessing what to build, what to fix, what bugs to prioritize, we saw exactly where users were getting stuck in our flow. And we left with tons of new actionable ideas and fixes, from better copy, smoother UI, and ultimately less friction points. Fullstory made this super easy, which is why I love the product. We used a ton of session replays on my team. There's now predictive modeling that you can use to drive personalization. There's AI-driven insights. You don't have to wonder what's not working anymore like my team did. You can see it. So if you're working in growth, product, or UX, Fullstory will change how you build and has become a huge part of the growth operating system that I teach to all my clients. You can see it for yourself at fullstory.com/value. That's fullstory.com/value. And so help us to connect the dots. You're in college, figuring out who you are and what you like while staying in school and all that good stuff. Yeah. How do you go from that world into what has become your career in product management and then eventually now kind of coaching executives?
Yeah, great question. It's a bit of a windy path. So in college, I studied biomedical engineering because I thought I wanted to go to med school. I decided a year into that I was not going to med school. It was too long and too much work. I then thought, okay, what can I get a job with out of college, given all the diverse set of classes that I took? And fun fact, biomedical engineering has the widest breadth in terms of types of classes you can take and still have it count towards your major. Like you could take mechanical, chemical, material science, biology, philosophy, like it all somehow counts. And so that's what I ended up graduating with, but still having like very little idea what I wanted to do. So I considered going into pharma, but then decided I didn't want to commit to the industry. And so I went to consulting at McKinsey for 2 years.
That was your first job out of school?
That was my first job out of school because
Wow.
their pitch was you don't have to decide what industry or function you want to work in. You can see a breadth of different types of places. And so I joined their Bay Area office. Technology was a huge up and coming area at that time. So I did actually do a bunch of different industries, pharma, retail, financial services. And I actually very much love technology because you can go to work in jeans and a t-shirt instead of the formal like consulting suit. And everything was just about innovation. It was about new ideas, new things, and just trying out different things and a very diverse group of people. So that's how I got into technology. I went from there to a strategy role, which is very classic coming out of McKinsey, and then to business school. And the reason I went to business school, this funny story, is that I wanted to do a startup. Like I wanted to be an entrepreneur. I had ideas that I wanted to go pursue. My parents were like, hell no, you cannot, go throw away your full-time job to like not make money for a number of years on some idea that you have. And so the compromise I found was actually to go to business school and to do a startup while I'm in business school. And so that's what I did. And I went to Harvard Business School. They were launching like their innovation lab at that time. And so they very much were like, let's throw resources and money and expertise at these new group of people or entrepreneurs. So it was a really good time to join the program. I did a startup while I was there. We did an accelerator program in the summer and then decided not to pursue that particular idea forward. So that's how I landed back in tech at a 20-person startup called Thumbtack. And they hired me for product management, even though I had very little product management experience. And it turned out to be something that I got pretty lucky in, landing in that spot at that time and being able to really grow with the company and my product career as a result of that.
So, I want to dig into some of these tough moments here. And I want to contextualize it for the listeners who don't know your full story. So UC Berkeley, Harvard Business School, you have the startup in the school, but then you get into Thumbtack, you go to Meta for a while, you're at Fuzzy, now you're an executive coach today. So objectively, from the outside looking in, you have a killer career, right? I think there's a lot of people who would look at your trajectory and go, my gosh, this is somebody who bats 1,000%, probably had a few speed bumps along the way, but like probably not the stuff that I go through. And so that's what I want to dig into, some of those speed bumps.
Yeah.
So maybe let's start with something in the early part of your career journey, a challenging moment that in the moment is hard and tough, but after a little bit of time and space, as you reflect back, massive personal growth. What comes to mind for you there?
Really, when I first started, as I had mentioned, I started supposedly in a product role, but I didn't do product for a very long time.
And this is at Thumbtack, right?
This is at Thumbtack, yeah.
And how big is Thumbtack when you joined? Because I know today it's probably a lot different than when you were there.
Yeah, so I joined when there were about 20 people, classically working out of a tiny office that I would probably call a version of a garage in like the Mission District in SF. Not the safest part, not the best, like don't walk outside at 10 p.m. at night type thing. So there were 20 people. They had actually almost run out of money right before I joined. But then they somehow managed to raise a round from Sequoia. And that was the only way they were actually able to bring me on, was to be able to raise that. So they were just coming off of a really, really difficult time as a company where I think it almost didn't exist. But then, was able to turn it around, landed an amazing, lead investor. But they were still coming off of the mentality. It was very much like, almost like, oh my gosh, we're going to run out of money tomorrow. And so that was the environment that I joined. There were 2 women total on the team, myself and the office manager. So classic, like Silicon Valley startup. And I remember when I joined, I spent the first couple of months being like, I'm not actually doing the thing that I was hired to do.
Classic startup move.
Yeah. They needed help in just about everything else, like customer support, branding, marketing, like everything except product. And so I remember getting very frustrated in my first year there, being like, why am I here? Like, I'm fine. Like, I'm actually quite capable of doing these other things for now, but that's not what I want to spend time on. And I don't know where this is going. Like, I don't know if I'm actually going to be able to build product or actually learn how to build product. And, what does that mean in terms of my career and where I want to go from there?
And why did you want to build product? Because that wasn't your background. Did you kind of have some vision of like what it might unlock for you, or like why was that important for you to grow in that role?
So I had a taste of it when I was building my own startup. I did the product role essentially. So the startup was a Netflix for wine. So we were trying to build like a intake process where we figure out what types of wine you like. And then in the back end, you would have all this inventory of wines people have never heard of, and then try to match those profiles to, what people say they like. So there was a product element of it. That's what I really enjoyed. And I felt that I was actually really good at connecting what we needed to build from like the engineering perspective with like what will make money and what people will buy from like the business perspective. So that was the first thing that attracted me to the role. The other is, as I mentioned, like in college, I discovered that I was actually quite good at communicating with different groups of people or different types of people. And I found that that was something very true in the product role, where you get to work with a bunch of different functions and a bunch of different types of people. And then the last thing I say is I like making decisions. When I was in consulting, I think it was 3 months in, I met a partner and he was like, do you like being the decision maker or the advisor? I was like, I want to make the decision. He was like, I don't know if consulting is going to be your long-term thing. And he was right.
Yeah.
It wasn't going to be my long-term thing because I actually just really like making the decision. And so, product was one of those roles where you can make decisions on where to go. And you sort of look to make those decisions.
And so in your head, so you're getting into product, you're motivated to get into the space. You have this probably cool opportunity at Thumbtack. They just got a round of funding. How did you envision it going? Like if everything went perfectly there, what's the story that you were starting to tell yourself in your head?
Yeah, well, I wanted to be a PM and build something cool for a couple of years. I didn't know what cool meant, but it was like, build something that has people using it. I can tell my mom about it and show my friends. It's a consumer-facing product. Be a PM for a couple of years, get promoted, start managing some people, get promoted again, eventually, lead a large team. That was pretty much as far as I got. Yeah.
And so you have this idea of where it could go. What stands in the way of that? So you mentioned you get in there, not quite doing the things that you wanted to do. How did that impact you and how did you kind of navigate some of that stuff?
When I got in there, like product was a part of it, but there were a lot of other things that the business needed. And I guess I had the most flexible background with my consulting background and doing my own startup. I had the most like flexible skill set, I suppose. And so I naturally was asked to do a bunch of different things. And I also do have a personality where I like to try a bunch of different things. So if you give me a challenge, I'll try it. Like build a brand. I'm like, what's a brand? Go do research, figure out what it takes to build a brand, what logos mean, fonts. Never spent so much time on a single word or phrase. But, I like to chase them down and figure out what it takes and then move on. And so it actually did match my personality well, even though it didn't match my career vision. And I think I did not see that at the time. I saw it as like, why do they keep putting me on a bunch of different things that I don't want to be doing that are okay when I'm in it? But like, I'm always like, how do I get back to product? How do I get back to product? And so in hindsight, I'm like, actually, that was a really good experience. But day to day while I'm in it, I'm like, oh, this is so frustrating. Like, when am I going to actually build some features or ship something or, learn what it is to design a flow from end to end? So definitely was very impatient those first couple of months.
Right. So the story that you're telling yourself in your head is, this is a distraction from me getting to where I want to go, not something that's helping me to ultimately get there, or maybe altering my plans, but in a good way.
And there's no one at the startup like telling you any kind of narrative, right? Like everybody is just super busy in their thing, like basically pointing at the next person who has some free time to do, put out the next fire. And so no one is telling you, oh, you're building different skills and connections and understanding how different parts of an organization work together. No one's telling you that. And so really, you're just kind of sitting there being like, hey, how come I'm not getting to invest in the area that I want to invest in? Which, by the way, is a very common coaching scenario when someone comes to you.
I was just going to say, I feel like I have lived this and then also heard about it from folks where, especially at a startup, like nobody's looking out for your career at a startup. Like there's no career path. It's like we hired you because we needed you to do this thing 3 months ago and you're here today. And like we got a 3-month backlog, go fast. And then you get in and you just kind of try to be helpful and you do things. And then you're a few months in and you feel like you never really got to do your thing that you were hired for, but you're still busy doing other stuff. And so if there are folks listening to this that are nodding along thinking, I'm in the middle of that today. Yeah. What would your advice be to someone who's in that messy middle?
Get to an outcome as quickly as you can. And so either land in a world where you know that this is sort of the indefinite future, or at least for longer than you would like it to be, and sort of have a sense of what that looks like, or push hard enough, the people around you, the environment, what is happening, to be like, okay, I have some confidence that this is going to change in 6 months, a year, whatever the time frame it is that you give yourself. When I was in this scenario, I pushed, but I don't think I pushed as hard as I could have. Because again, I was fresh out of business school. This was first time in a product role, first time in a startup. I wasn't really sure, like, hey, what should I be optimizing for? And I kind of had this question of like, should I be optimizing for my own career? Because if I think about it, most of what I'm getting paid for is in equity. And that's only going to be worth something if the company does well. And so in a way, I was torn. I was kind of like, it wasn't clear to me that optimizing for my career aligned with optimizing for my equity value. Sorry, Thumbtack, and what the company was going to do. And so, by the way, I very much believe in giving early employees startup equities for this reason. And it felt like, okay, all the things that I was doing actually was helping the company do better, especially like when you work on brand and PR, and, you put out these large billboards and, you do like all this publicity stuff. And like, it actually does feel good in a different way. But then you go back to, this wasn't what I was brought in to do. This was not like how I imagined it to be. And so going back to your question, I would try to figure out that misalignment as quickly as possible to be like, hey, do I really want this to change? How quickly do I need it to change? And then set a timeline for yourself. Because being in this, like, is it this? Is it that? Am I happy? Am I not happy? Is not a very sustainable state.
And I feel like sometimes people get it the other way too, which is I miss the way it used to be. It used to be so different. Now we've grown and my job has changed and I miss the old thing that it was. And so I can go that way too. You said something like, I wish I pushed harder. Yeah. If you could go back in time, what would you tell yourself? What does pushing harder mean? What could you have done that you didn't, I guess, in hindsight?
One, I didn't actually sit down and think about it all that much most of the time.
Because you were so busy, right? You were in it.
We were in startup mode, right? Like I was just running from project to project. There was a disconnect in my head, but I didn't sit down and say like, how hard do I want to push? Do I really want to make this happen? And what am I going to give up? Or like, what do I have to change as a result? So that's the first thing. Like I didn't actually sit down and truly, truly process it. Two, when I did get to a point where I felt like, okay, I really need to start pushing in this other direction, I went about it from a very self-centered way, like me first perspective. It was like, this is what I want, right? Like, this is what I need, rather than framing it in more of a, this is what the company needs perspective. And this is something I definitely learned much later on. But when I was pushing, it was like, I need you to do this for me. And, as a PM, it's not like you have a ton of leverage in that aspect versus framing it as like, hey, this is the top priority for the company. And therefore, this is where the most impact will be. So you should put me on something like this, right? Like, and just framing it differently with the leadership and the CEO and the founders, so the conversation goes a bit more smooth. So yeah, I think those two things are important. Luckily, I did eventually actually do product.
I was going to say, you were there for 5 years.
Give me a product
role. Yeah, I was curious if there's like a change moment where something shifts.
Yeah, I think the engineering team grew large enough that we needed multiple PMs. We needed to sort of divide up. And also we needed multiple priorities happening at the same time. And so once we got sort of the baseline functions for the non-product functions like customer support and operations and marketing, the focus really went back to product, and it stayed there for a very long time, the next like 4 years, really, where Thumbtack and its founders had a very product first mentality. So every issue that we came across, even if it was a marketing problem, it was a product problem first. And so we had a very, very strong product leadership and product first mentality. And so I guess unsurprisingly, once we had that baseline in the other functions, like I got pulled back to, okay, even if you're doing growth marketing, you're doing a product first, right? You're not going out and sort of doing classic marketing. So luckily for me, the way that the environment shaped up and the way that company culture was being built, it was very product first. So that naturally drew me back into product work.
So you didn't have to learn to play the political game or any of that stuff. Not in this role anyways.
No, and I think I would have failed if I had to really, push for it. I don't think my career would have played out the same way.
Have you ever had to play the political games or been in an environment where to get ahead or to win, either you had to or were encouraged to play some of the political games internally?
So when I was early in my career, I always thought about politics as like a bad word. I think a lot of people have this philosophy when they start out.
I think even when I said it, it came out with like a bad energy. Yeah.
So many people are like, oh, politics, right? Like, we don't want to play politics. Like, it's a bad thing, like, especially in startup tech culture. People just kind of want to pretend like it doesn't happen and everything's a meritocracy. In reality, that's not true. And I remember this was still at Thumbtack. About 4 years in, I randomly found a book on like our classic startup bookshelf that was called The Politics of Promotion. And I decided randomly, not super randomly, I was getting a little bit frustrated, which we can get into, about not getting my next level of promotion. So I decided to pick it up. I was like, okay, look, the term exists for a reason. And before I fully just like ignore it and dismiss it, let me at least learn what it is, right? And what it involves. And if I'm like, no, this is super not relevant in this day and age, we're in a meritocracy or whatever, then cool. Like, wasted 2 hours, but read a book and learned something about something that is no longer applicable.
Just before we keep going, this book is in the office?
So Thumbtack had this bookshelf. It was a very fancy bookshelf back in the days when people invested a lot in offices. And it just had a bunch of random leadership books. And so anyone can take one. It had Good to Great, Lean Startup, like all your classic leadership, tech, product reading. And this was a tiny little book, like this big, had like 2 pictures of people on it. And like very old, looked like it was at least 20 years old. And it was just randomly sitting on one of the like bottom shelves. And for some reason that day, I sat on a chair right next to it and I saw it. And it kind of I was like, well, it's a small book. Like, can't take that long to go through. I actually have never looked up whether it exists on Amazon. I might do this afterwards. And I just decided to like flip through it because I was like, I don't know what I don't know. So let me figure out what is politics and is that a thing that I need to care about? So really that was the first time that I looked into and really considered the concept. And I feel like after reading it, my takeaway was politics is very much a thing. We just call it different things. We call it influence. We call it leading without authority. We call it getting mentorship and sponsorship. There's all these ways that, for some reason, we now talk around it, versus I'm now of the opinion that maybe we should actually just talk about the thing a bit more and go back to just kind of calling it as it is, which is it does matter how others perceive you and what types of relationship you have with others. And so that was really the first time that I kind of jump into that world.
Hey, I hope you're enjoying this episode of the show. If you are, please don't forget to hit that subscribe button on whatever platform you're listening on. It's the best way for you to support the show. It helps the algorithm find other listeners just like you. And as your host, I'd really appreciate it. If you're feeling extra generous, a quick rating or review if you're on Apple Podcasts or Spotify also make a massive difference. Thank you so much for your support. Back to the episode. That's really interesting to hear you say that. I don't think I've called it that either. But somewhere along the line, I learned that you won't be successful if you can't speak the language that your executive team and leadership team cares about. You can get in the room based on your merit and your accolades and your tactical skills. But when you're in the room, when they're debating many ideas or solutions to an idea, there's a language of influence. And it's different at different companies. Like sometimes it's your seniority or your tenure, or like if it's your company versus you're an employee at the company, sometimes it's based on data or debate or storytelling. And for a long time, I just thought I was like a data guy. And I was like, well, I'll just share the data. And like, that's my tool of influence. And I learned that got me in the room, but to get my ideas to get other folks on board with my ideas, I needed to learn their language. And I'd never called it politics. And it took me 15 years too long to learn this. And so you pick up this book and it starts to teach you at least the foundations of this. How did your career change after reading that? Or what did you do differently after reading that?
I think I went through one of the more classic progressions that happens in your career where you go from like, I'm just going to execute. I'm just going to do a really good job at my job and deliver, right? Ship, have impact, etc. to like, I am now going to spend the majority of the time figuring out what relationships I need to build and what people I need to convince that I have good ideas and good strategy. And this is something that I focus on a lot in my coaching these days as well. It's such a step change because to your point, you realize just having the data, just doing the work gets you in the room, but it doesn't get you like in the decision-making seat. And so that was also, it was around the time that I picked up that book and started reading about, because, the book talked about relationships and how, you have to learn power dynamics. Again, power is also something people don't like to talk about.
Right.
Power dynamics, relationships, how that actually works in organizations, how organizational design affects those things of, structure and org structure and process. Anyway, so that was the first time you and I went to business school. I feel like maybe they did teach that, but maybe I forgot. But it was the first time I was like, oh, like there's a whole other set of work that I was not doing at all, not spending any time on. And I was just kind of letting it happen, right? Whatever happened, happened. And that was really when I started controlling the narrative and figuring out who I need to build relationships with and figuring out what rooms I needed to get into rather than just kind of taking things as they come and focus on like, let me build great product.
And I think everyone listening to this can probably close their eyes and picture someone, especially early in your career, who gets in front of the room. In your head, you're like, I said the same fucking thing last week in the meeting. How come I'm not in front of the room? How come they're getting the attaboys or attagirls? And it's like, I didn't know that there was this other skill set. And it's maybe more important than the tactical skill set. It's like, can you translate for, sometimes I'll call it like non-native speakers. Like, can you translate what you want to do in a way that makes sense to other folks who aren't living and breathing your capability every day? So you start tuning into this. And you were sharing all this in the context of being frustrated about getting a promotion. And so tell us more about how this book fits into that challenge and how you worked through it.
As I mentioned, I started out in my career at McKinsey, right? And I don't know how familiar people are with the career progression there, but it's basically every 2 years you get promoted or you get asked to leave. So it's an up and out culture, right? And It's very clear, you get promoted or you get asked to go somewhere else and become their clients in the future. It's a good model. And so when I was at Thumbtack, I kind of had the same mentality or like expectation of that's what would happen, right? Like I would do a really good job. I would get promoted after a year and a half, 2 years, and that would just kind of keep going indefinitely. And that was not what happened. So I did get my first promotion a year and a half in, going from like entry-level PM to a senior PM, leading multiple teams, and then going to management and getting into that first level of management and managing a couple of teams. That was going great. But then 4 years in, around this time I was saying in the book, I was like, hey, I'm ready for my next promotion, right? Like, I want to be a director. I want to manage multiple managers. And it just was not happening. I had done some of the very basic things of like talking to my manager, who was a VP at the time. Hey, I want to be a director. There were no directors at the time.
How large is Thumbtack at this point? So you're there, you're 4 years in, you started, there was 20 people, one of 2 women. At this stage in the company, roughly, do you remember?
We had a huge operations team in the Philippines, but the team in the Bay Area was probably about 300 at the time. The PM team was maybe 12 and maybe 150, 160 engineers. So it was a very lean PM to engineering ratio. And then we had a bunch of infrastructure teams.
I'm asking for a specific reason because it's usually kind of around, I think it's usually around like 150, 200 where there's like formalized leveling. And sometimes like, this is what a director is. This is who this is. You're this, you're not that, right? When there's 20 people, your title is your capability and you do a mishmash of stuff. And sometimes you do stuff that when there's 200 people, you wouldn't be doing, but when there's 20, somebody's got to do it and you're that person. And so is that kind of what's going on? Like, so there's a little bit of leveling. You're in this manager role. You're trying to level up. Is there like formalized, you got to do this to be a director stuff yet?
So no, at that point in time, we did not have formal leveling. Thumbtack was actually quite late to have formal leveling. It didn't happen until the year after I left, which was 2 more years. And we were almost like 1,000 people at that point. So we
Wow.
did it quite late. And part of the reason is a lot of our founding engineers were ex-Google and they did not believe in hierarchy. And so, it was a very, again, high engineer to PM ratio, like flat hierarchy. I was actually the only PM manager on the team. All the other PMs and me just reported directly to the head of the VP of product. And so it was a very, very flat org. And, in hindsight, it's like, I don't know if actually the director title would have changed anything because there was not a formal leveling. But I just felt like, hey, it's been this many years. I should get I should get that next step up. How come it's not happening? And so that was really when I was really questioning, like, hey, what is the expectation at this level? Like, what do you expect someone to do? For better or worse, our VP of product, it was also his first time in the VP of product role. And so I kind of learned this later on because we ended up hiring a CPO from Google. And he kind of came in and did the leveling and set expectations and created formality, I guess, in those levels. And that helped me actually understand what these different roles were. But at the time of this conversation, when I was picking up the book, none of that was in place. It was just like, I feel like I should be getting something more. So what's the next step up in the title?
And so you mentioned that you were talking to your manager about it. You find this book. Like, had you tried other things that sort of weren't working? Like, outside of just wanting to be promoted director, was there other stuff that you had tried that just wasn't moving the needle?
Yeah, I did the classic, like, let me work harder and do more things.
Yep. Let me take on more and work later and harder.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let me take on more work. Let me take on more things. Actually, funny enough, going back to some of the things I was doing very early at the company, I built out the analytics function. I built out our research function, content strategy. Like I hired the first of and then like heads of for those different functions. I like PM'd an infrastructure team where the only question I asked was, hey, we had 5 like critical failures. Have we solved all 5? Like that was literally like the extent of my support. But yeah, I worked harder. Like I took on more things. I did more things. I had more teams that either officially or unofficially were looking to me for direction and leadership, but wasn't getting me further in the career conversation at all.
And so what did? So what changes? Because looking at your resume or looking at your LinkedIn profile, eventually you do make it to head of product for one of the lines of business, I think. And so what unlocked that?
So it was interesting. Sometimes people ask me, how do you build influence so that you can harness that influence and get that next level promotion? I was in an interesting situation where because I had been so early at the company, at that point I had been there for 4 years. I've seen so much of like all the various different functions and I know people in all the various functions. My informal influence was actually quite high. It was just, I didn't know where to direct it. Like, I didn't know what to do with it. I directed it primarily at, let me ship more things, let me do more projects, rather than let me influence strategic decisions, org decisions, like where the company was heading. So I directed it completely downwards in a way, like at the various teams, and the broader growing team. Company was growing like crazy, which took a lot of energy and effort, but I wasn't directing it upwards. And so the main change that happened was I started directing it upwards after reading the book. And after learning that this is the thing I needed to do, was I actually needed to have an opinion about org structure, strategy, what we should invest in next, what the company should do next. And I think once I figured out that that was a thing I needed to do, it actually came very naturally. It didn't feel super like, I then needed to take a bunch of courses or build up my influence or, rebuild a bunch of things. It was actually just a matter of redirecting it in a different direction and focusing more on strategy conversations and org conversations that would then lead to the need for a director or a head of like role and then getting that role created. So it was a bit about figuring out how companies operated, aligning with like annual planning cycles and org conversations and reorg, and figuring out like how do I get ahead of some of those conversations so that I'm best positioned to where I want to go as a result of them.
Were you exposed to those things before? I guess I'm trying to understand, was it your perspective change or tactically did you do different things? Because I think there's one way to hear your story, which is probably you were involved in annual planning and org structure stuff, but maybe you viewed it as an interruption to the real work, which is like working with your teams and unlocking stuff and shipping more things versus viewing it as actually the most important thing. And then sort of your secondary job is managing kind of the day-to-day capability work. Is it like just a shift in perspective or tactically did you start to do new things?
It was both for me. So it was definitely a shift in perspective of like, what is the highest priority and where do I want to spend my attention? And then tactically getting into the forums and the conversations before they happen. So I would say that prior to this, yes, like ad hoc, I would get looped into a question about what do you think of this design of the org, right? Like, but it would already be like 80% done at that point. I'd be like, looks great, sounds good, but I wouldn't think as much about it. Or like, what do you think of this direction on strategy? But it would, and again, I would just be like, yeah, it sounds like it's not relevant to what I'm working on, and so my reaction was very different. And over time, that means I wasn't looped into as many of those forums because they're like, well, Killer Yui doesn't care.
Right. Or you end up getting that feedback that's like, oh, you need to be more strategic. You're like, what does that mean? It's like, right. So it's a little bit of that. Okay.
Yeah. So then, with this new perspective, then it was actually about, it's different to react to things that people put in front of you versus you having a perspective on this is, I think, where I think we should go. And then you creating those forums to, make that the decision and to make that happen. And I remember one of the biggest questions I had when I first started out was like, I don't have a forum for this conversation. Like, what do I do? And I remember like I was talking to one of my friends and I was like, I'm trying to build the strategy for the seller side of the marketplace. And I think we should go in this direction, but this team doesn't exist. And like, we don't have resources. So like, nobody's talking about it. Like, what do I do? Do I just talk about it in my normal team meetings? Because my team doesn't care. Do I talk about it in my one-on-ones? Like, I legitimately didn't know you could go and create forums. Like, it was just like a wall that my brain hit that was like, what do I do? Like, there's no forum to talk about this. And then I remember my friend was like, well, you make the forums. Like, you create the meetings. I'm like, oh, sounds super simple. But for me, it was like a huge like, oh, so like I could go do this. I could create a forum. I could have this meeting and we can have this conversation. And then that could actually be the thing that happens. And that, I think, took me from like, hey, give me a thing, let me execute it, and sort of transition that into like, this is what I think we should be doing. Let's go make it happen. Let me go like get buy-in, which I didn't know what that was starting out. Get buy-in, alignment, debate, learn how people make decisions, whether they care about data or research. And it just made a bigger picture make sense. I'm like, oh, this is why we do research. This is why we have data. This is why storytelling is a thing. And it just made a lot more pieces fall into place.
I love that framing, which is, I have this thing that isn't being done. I think we should do it. Let me create a forum to talk about it with other people who I can get on the same page and maybe form a team and start working on this stuff. Because I feel like there's a lot of people who have these ideas, and instead of doing that, they either complain about it or they ask around like, how come no one's talking about this? Like, I don't understand. And right. And so it's a shift from that, which is more reactive and maybe whiny in some cases in the example I'm giving, to, hey, I have an opportunity or there's a problem that I see, and here's my next step, and here's who I should talk to about it. And we'll see if we can get on the same page and move forward. And I have a recommendation for what moving forward looks like. So it's not just seeing the problem. I had a boss tell me once, you get 1 point for seeing the problem, but you get 3 if you come with a bunch of solutions and a recommendation. And it's kind of that shift.
Yeah. And it's 5 points if you actually do it in the right way with the right format and the right people.
Ooh, now we're talking. Yeah. Major points.
Yeah, because that was something I did wrong in the beginning too, was also classically, I would just like write a document and be like, this is what we should do. Right. And everyone's like, no, here's a bunch of objections. And so I learned over time, there's a better way and a worse way to try to get your ideas heard, depending on the culture and the place you're at. And generally speaking, like writing a long document and putting it in front of people is one of the wrong ways to do it.
Right. Writing the document might help you gain clarity that you need, but then you should go talk to them once you have the clarity and you've organized your thoughts and you've gotten it all out. Hey, I'm sorry for interrupting this episode of the show, but I wanted to share something that I'm super excited about and I think you're going to love as well, which is the Growth Leadership Scorecard. Something new and free, and I just launched this. The context is over the past 3 years, I've coached more than 60 different growth leaders, people that have director, VP, or head of growth titles. And what I've seen is that the same challenges keep coming up again and again when it comes to crafting compelling growth strategy, implementing the growth operating system, stepping into the leadership of one of these crazy cross-functional teams, and then ultimately growing your career in this capability. And that's why I created this 19-question scorecard. Will help you to self-assess where you're at in your career, identify some of your blind spots, and then get instant actionable ideas on exactly where you can improve so that you become indispensable to your company. This is the same mental checklist I've been using behind the scenes with clients for the last few years to help them level up. Now I'm making it public. You can check it out for yourself. We'll put a link to it in the show notes below. I know you're going to find it super valuable. All right, enough from me. Back to the show. And so I want to shift gears a little bit. So you're at Thumbtack for a while. Is your next stop right after that to Meta?
Yes. So I joined Instagram. Yeah.
Instagram. And so I'm curious to know, well, one, if you can contextualize what Instagram is like when you worked there. And then what I'm really curious to dig into is how was it different moving up the ladder at Thumbtack compared to what you experienced at Meta?
Thumbtack was about 600 people when I left. I had a team of 3 or 4 PMs and, a lot of informal influence and authority because I had been there for 5 years at that point. I got to Instagram. Instagram was actually not much bigger. It was 800 people. Had a team of 40 PMs. I joined the consumer team based out of the new SF office. And I actually joined as an individual contributor. I had gotten tired at Thumbtack of doing the manager thing, all the recruiting, and it felt like I wasn't really building product anymore. So when I joined Instagram, I decided to go back to an IC role. And I joined a very small but very senior team. Like the engineers had been there for 10 years, super senior. And it was like a labs team. And the goal for the team was to figure out what to do with the Instagram feed. They had just launched stories, like their copy of Snapchat, a year ago. It was clearly doing really well. So the view on feed was declining. And I don't know if you remember back, Facebook had gone through some of the same things where they were starting to see decreases in engagement on the Facebook feed. And then so they started doing what are called edge posts, which is like your friend shared this or like Andrew commented on this and that became a post on your feed. But it made it feel a lot more commercial, a lot less personal and connected. A lot less like your first degree friends doing things. So the question Instagram had was, what do we do? Do we just make stories like the whole thing, right? Because it was like tray at the top and the full feed. Do we make stories the whole thing? And they was like, we definitely don't want to do what Facebook did. It's funny, there was a big rivalry between. We definitely don't want to do what the Blue app did. So we're not going to do edge posts and make it feel more impersonal. We want to go the other direction. But what is that? There was a crazy question of should we just kill feed, like the profile photos, and just have stories? Or if not, what should feed become? And what should that part of the app become? It was also making them a ton of money. So you couldn't just shut off billions of dollars of revenue overnight. And so the team that I was on was this small, I think it was 5 people, 1 for each platform, backend, the super senior designer, and myself. And we just came up with a bunch of crazy ideas on what we could do with the future of this. And it was really, really fun. So I went from managing people on a broader scale to let me just go build crazy things. I think the best engineers, designers I will probably ever have the, ability to work with, and a very more hierarchical, structured environment. Because Thumbtack was awesome. And again, we had a lot of founding engineers that were from Google. And then we brought in a lot of leadership that were ex-Google and Meta and Airbnb. So great group of people. But Instagram had already gotten to that point where they have grown up. They've gotten their processes, they have review mechanisms. It was very put together. And so it was the first time I was dealing with innovation, but in a structured world. And there were definitely special treatment.
So for the listeners, and I'm trying to go back in time because I worked at HubSpot and I was there when there was less than 200 people. And then I was there when there was 1,500 people. And what I'm picturing in my mind is you're being eloquent about it. But what I'm picturing in my mind is a shit ton of approvals. where it's like, I got an idea. And what I used to be able to do was just go run with it and then tell everybody what I did and how it went. And now all of a sudden there's like meetings about the meeting to prep for the other meeting and like endless layers of like, this is me projecting. Is that what it felt like in comparison?
It's a good question. There were two aspects of it. One was people had scope, like they owned a particular part of the product and the particular part of the experience, right? And their performance depended on that. So there was a huge like ownership, accountability. You really need to hit your goals. Instagram was a very high performing team. So like a lot of just like competition and making sure that like you didn't touch what they owned. So that was one aspect. The other was definitely like it's approvals. I guess at the end of the day, you could think of it as approvals, but it's also just like process that you had to go through, right? The designs that you did, the backend architecture. I've never worked so much with legal and privacy and policy, globalizing it for 1 billion users across the world. There was just a lot of process. Like everything that you did went through lots of reviews, lots of checks and balances to make sure that it ended up being a thing that you can like launch to 1 billion people. And so when you're working on more mature parts of Instagram, there's just a ton of that. But because we were supposed to be more of an innovative team, and I had like very senior engineers who kind of knew people and the back doors to things, we were able to sort of get around some of that. Again, not all of it. We were able to sort of fast track some of that and really sort of get some ideas out there that probably wouldn't have been tested and wouldn't have been put out there otherwise. Because as you know, like Instagram at the time I was there was in the news like every day. Like every small thing that we put out there, somebody wrote an article about it, right? And so we couldn't even launch it to like 1,000 people because somebody like goes through the app source code and goes, what's the diff between the new version and the old version? They don't care if it's out to 1,000 people. Like somebody's job is to sit there and like reverse engineer what you just launched. And so it was definitely like a very fun and like interesting environment, but like in corporate, right? Where you had so much attention and eyes on everything that you were doing.
And so how does that impact the culture of like one, how people interact with each other, and then two, the games that you may or may not have to play to move up the ladder there?
Instagram was actually not very well known for career progression because they also had a very lean team. So when I joined, they were at 1 billion users. It was a team of 800 with 40 PMs with 1 billion users.
It's just crazy to think about that scale. Yeah.
Right? So compared to Facebook at the time, when I say I was a PM on Instagram profile, like the profile page, and all of like the creation flows for uploading and sharing your photos to the Instagram feed. My equivalent role at Facebook Blue was like 100 PMs. Like the org size was just very different. And so from a moving up perspective, there wasn't really room or a need for there to be more seniority until they actually added more people on the team. And Instagram very much believed in like running very, very lean. And so everyone kind of knew that if they wanted to move up, especially in PM, that it wasn't going to happen on Instagram. You go somewhere else. Like, and it was actually easier to go somewhere else and make that happen.
And so how does that impact like the day-to-day, week-to-week interactions with other teams? Because I imagine it's a pretty performance culture based on what you shared, but people aren't moving up. And so do you kind of end up in this place where it's like a lot of turf wars and stuff like that if people aren't necessarily collaborating and they're hyper-focused on their thing, but they're not getting ahead? And so I'm just trying to put myself into the shoes of what that might have felt like and then pull out if there's any parallels for stuff that folks are navigating today.
So I think the interesting about the culture there was because it was such a great place to be from so many different perspectives at the time that people didn't care very much about their own career progression. They cared about the fact that like I could build something and 1 billion people are going to use it, right? Like I could put something out there and it's going to impact societal norms for, X thing. And so I think that especially in product, most of the people that were there because they wanted to see what it was like to build product at that scale. And across all the functions, just amazing people, like spectacular, super talent. Like Meta has great people, Instagram had amazing people. Like, and so everybody loved the people that we're working with. So I think it was a combination of that and just like the ability to like build a product like that that just everybody was very happy about and kept them there. But
Yeah.
eventually, I think almost everyone I know kind of moved on. Like they moved on to other roles, either within Meta or to a different company. It was a time where it was not very difficult to sort of leave Instagram and land a more senior role. So whenever someone was like, okay, now it's time for me to focus on my career, usually the conversation goes, okay, which startup do you want to join? Or, which other team at Facebook might be interesting? Then you just kind of knew like, I'm here for this. And if I wanted something else and I'm optimizing for that, then it's time to go somewhere else.
And the book that we were talking about a few minutes ago at Thumbtack that you read, which is all about learning
Politics of promotion.
politics of promotion. Did anything that you learned in that come into play, or was that useful during your time at Meta or at Instagram rather?
I would say that this mindset shift of focusing on relationships and not exactly like what is right, but most effective was probably one of the most useful things going into a larger company.
Yeah.
So I think that at the end of the day, for a long time, I was focused on like, what did I think was the right product to build? Like I had an opinion about like, what is the best thing that I could build? And, it started at Thumbtack, but really came to be true. Instagram was what was the most effective thing for me to do at the moment? What was the thing that I was going to get through legal, privacy, policy, design reviews, engineering reviews, all the executives, and actually put something out there, right? And it might not be what I thought was like the best thing, but it's a thing that's going to get out there. And like, that's better than not getting something out there. And so that was definitely one very useful thing to have sort of gone in with. And then the other is really this idea that there's like the environment and you can't control everything about the environment. I think when I was at Thumbtack and earlier in my career, I felt like I had control over lots of things, probably like misconception, right? But when I went to Instagram, I really realized, oh my gosh, there's like so many things that I don't control. And, it's partly because you're serving a billion users and there's stuff happening around the world. Like we were going to launch in this market. This thing happened. We're not launching in that market. We're launching somewhere else, right? There were just so many things that are outside of your control and you can either get frustrated about it and kind of bang your head against it, or you can kind of work around it and figure out like what's your next best alternative. I think coming from a startup where I wanted to solve all the problems and own everything, I actually really had to kind of take that hat off and be like, these is a bucket of things I could not control and I cannot solve. I'm just going to walk away from them or like, figure out how to manage them. And I'm going to focus over here instead. And that was, I think, definitely a change going into big companies where I was okay, I just can't control this whole thing over here.
One of the other things that you said a few minutes ago was one of the other big things you noticed going into Instagram was that it felt like a little bit more like a real company in comparison in terms of like process and review systems and things like that. I'd love to double click on reviews and feedback. It's one of the things I hear about all the time from folks who I get to work with. They have some piece of feedback that they have held on to for a long period of time. And I'm curious to know whether at Thumbtack, Meta, or anywhere else, what comes to mind for you when you think about feedback that was either hard to hear in the moment or pivotal to you and who you've become?
I mean, this one's going to sound classic in a way, but people don't like being told what to do. So I think Thumbtack, Meta, Instagram, and then when I was at Fuzzy, the leadership style that I believe in is very much of a empathy first, servant leadership versus, lead by authority, lead by sort of saying this is what I think needs to happen. And I think it's just a lesson that I learn and relearn at different scale in different contexts, because I actually think it's a part of human nature to tell people what to do. Like, especially when you think you have a lot of context, when you think you have experience, it is kind of our like gut instinct in a way to be like, well, this is what I think should be done, right? Even if you're not telling them exactly, you're like, hey, this is what I think should happen, right? And when you get more senior, you're paid to have an opinion. You're paid to be like, this is what I think we should do. But then it's about figuring out like, when should you actually do that? And when should you actually hold back? And when should you actually really focus on empowering your team? That I think forces me to learn this lesson like over and over, because I think there's so many different layers to it and dimensions to it that, it starts with this idea of like influencing your teams and your peers, but then it gets more nuanced because, well, sometimes you do have to make a decision. And so when do you actually just make a decision and disagree and commit? Okay, one more layer of complexity, right? Like, what if you're the only person who can make this call? Do you make the call or do you still ask other people? Versus they're like, wait, Yuli, that's your job. Like, you make the call because only you can make it. So I think there's so many nuances to it. By the end of the day, it's like learning, when do I actually say, this is what needs to happen and stick to it? And when do you say, hey, I want to empower the team and I want you guys to come up with the ideas and the solutions and build a culture around that?
How do you know if you're doing this wrong? For folks who are listening to this that are struggling with this themselves, what are the symptoms to fucking it up?
Usually bad decisions. Either decisions that you look at and you're like, that could have gone better, right? Or this could have gone faster, this could have been better quality, had more, whatever it is. It was like, that just wasn't the best decision. That's usually one. The other is if the people around you are losing motivation and people are just kind of like clocking in, clocking out, collecting a paycheck, always thinking about what other jobs are out there. I'm just sticking around because the market's not great. Like, you get a sense for the morale of the team and how much they're really bought into what they're doing. And then ultimately, I mean, you see it in the company performance over time, right? Like, you see it in, are we being innovative? Are we staying ahead of competition? Bringing the best people and talent into the company. So in the let's say year time frame, we actually do see it at the higher level. But in the short term, it's usually like, one, why do I have to make all the decisions? Tends to be something to think about. If you find yourself like always making decisions, that's one thing to think about. Two, I feel like there could be better decisions here or like better ideas, but I'm not hearing them and I'm not getting them. That's usually another signal. And then the motivation of the team. Those tend to be more visible in short term and signals that like you're leaning too heavily on like, this is what I think versus how do I get everyone to come up with ideas and solutions and enabling them to go try them.
I feel like built into this is like in everyone's head, they've got that one cool manager that they've always thought about that was hands off, that let them like do their thing, that they always decided in their mind, when I grow up and become a people leader, whatever way that picture is in your mind, when I grow up and become that person, I'm going to do it just like they did. And then on the flip side, you've got folks who have worked for a meddler or a micromanager who have like told you what to do, and that hasn't felt good. And so that's sort of the tension is like, we have these experiences. We know how it feels to be on the receiving end, but we kind of don't actually know what's going on behind the scenes with that other person. Like, are they in good standing? Are they making the right decision? Are they getting coached that they should be doing something differently? And that's kind of the challenge here for folks that are maybe struggling with this for the first time. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, so you almost always get just one dimension of that, right? So to your point, you get that version of that person at that time and that version of yourself at that time, right? And you're never going to get a different combination, unfortunately, but you always have that one side of the story. And then interestingly enough for me, I actually often try to look for the other sides of that story. So I did have amazing managers like at Thumbtack, at Meta. Like, I was very lucky to work for some amazing folks. But then like I would also hear the other side from other people. And I don't know if it's just something about me or the way, but I find that while I have a particular view or interpretation or way of interacting with this person, other people often have very different perspectives. And so one thing that I always actually remind myself to do is like ask other people what is their interpretation of like my manager or their leadership style, because I'm always surprised at the answer. I don't know, I have a blind spot in that, but I'm always surprised what they say. And then if I keep asking the question, like 3 years later, 5 years later, so if I meet someone who works for, let's say, my manager at Thumbtack, I actually just met someone like last year, I was like, what's he like now? Like, can you tell me what he's like now? What's his leadership style like? And then there'll be some similarities, but then there's some things I'm like, oh, really? Like, that's what he's working on? Like, oh, that's how he's changed. Like, so it's very interesting to learn like how people actually grow through time. And I'm sure the people who worked with me at Thumbtack, now that I'm a coach, might be like, oh, that makes total sense. Or then I'd be like, what the heck? Like, where did her life go? Why is she a coach? So I do think there's very different aspects to leadership. And depending on what position you're in, you might get a very different perspective as well.
I'm going to infer here a little bit, which is if you're in this position, if you are in a new leadership position and sort of struggling between the tension of leaning in too much or maybe being too passive and delegating out too much, it sounds like one thing that they could do would be to get more feedback from some of their peers and maybe folks who report to them and folks who are maybe peers horizontally. Is that right? Or are there other things that are actionable that they could do to work on this skill and get more awareness?
I always think that figuring out where your expectations are coming from and what they are is an undervalued and underinvested in skill set. So I think what often happens is even when we become executives and leaders, we say like, oh, this is what I'm expected to do. Like, this is what I need to do. And you just take it at face value. Like if the board says like, hey, you need to grow revenue by 20%, you grow revenue by 20%, right? The board says like, hey, this needs to happen, or your CEO says this needs to happen. You're like, yeah, I need to make that happen. Or, when I was at Instagram or Meta, some VP comes in and is like, we need this strategy, or we need this thing. We need to figure out this market. You take it at face value. You might ask some questions around it, but you almost always just kind of say like, okay, this is the thing that I need to go do. And we often don't ask enough questions. It's the same thing when it comes to this question of like, do I just make the decision or do I like empower the team to run with it? I think too few times we actually ask, I found that it's actually very helpful sometimes to ask the team and be like, do you think we should be making a decision faster? Do you feel like you're getting to a decision, or should I step in more here and help get to a decision? And we often don't even ask that question. We kind of just like sit in our heads and we assume like, should I not? Right? Like, and then you might decide one way and then jump in and then have it be the wrong decision. The team gets frustrated, or you jump in too late and you're like, why didn't you jump in sooner? Versus kind of just actually asking that question and putting it out there and then have other people respond to that. And I think often we underestimate how much we can question various constraints in our environment, but also just directly get feedback on like, should I be jumping in sooner? Do you want me to jump in sooner? And it doesn't, I think some people fear that it means like, oh, you don't know what you're doing. Like, oh, you don't know like whether you should jump in. And generally speaking, the perception is the opposite. It's like, oh, so glad you asked, right? I was actually hoping you could jump in sooner, or I was hoping we could get more time. Like people are very upfront about that. So I think there's this fear that holds us back that's like, oh, we should know. And it's kind of scary if you don't know versus just kind of putting it out there and asking the question and inviting that feedback.
I love that. For you at this point in your career, are there certain habits and rituals that you lean on to bring out your best performance on a day in, day out basis? Working in tech is hard. Stress can run high, even as a coach. So I'm curious how you operate, if there are certain tenets to that are helpful.
Yeah, exercise. I think exercise and nutrition and getting sleep, like sort of the defaults of staying healthy, is really important. I think that one of the other core tenets I abide by is like when you are seeing things go wrong, rather than do more things faster, like actually slow down, like force yourself to do fewer things and more slowly. And so as a habit, sort of starting in my earlier days, when things were going wrong, I would try to do more things to try to like fix the thing, right? Or to like make the thing go right.
It's so relatable. It's so relatable. Yes.
Yeah. So now I'm running my own coaching business. If 1 month I'm like, oh, I don't have enough clients. Oh my gosh, let me like post on social media. Let me do this. Well, you start doing more things. And actually the more useful thing is to do less and to actually think about what you're doing more. And so really like slowing it down and doing more reflection. So that's become one of my tenets where I'm trying to change that instinct to go from something's wrong, do more, to something's wrong, I'm going to sleep on it. And I'm going to slow down everything else I'm doing to see like, and really ask like, do I need to be doing this? And should I be doing this differently?
It's so hard to do that. So hard to slow down.
It's so counterintuitive.
And I feel like everyone is scared, especially if you're in house, to say I'm doing less, even if it means you're doing more and better in terms of whatever that is, and hyper focused on whatever the main things are. It's so hard for folks to do that. And So I empathize, plus one, obviously, to what you said. And that's a major challenge, I think, for a lot of us.
Yeah. And actually, it comes down to the framing a bit. So many things come down to the framing. But you can think of it as like, oh, I'm doing fewer things, like number, count of whatever things, actions. Or you can think of it as I'm doing more of the right things, right? Because when you're doing so many different things, the problem is that you don't know whether you're doing the right thing. So you could be like throwing 20 arrows at the board and only one of them hits, right? Versus I'm slowing down. So I'm throwing 5 arrows, but 4 of them are going to hit, right? And so it's a bit of how you talk about what you're doing that really matters in this context.
And the I am phrasing, which for folks who are listening that aren't familiar with the I am phrasing, super helpful making any change, which is to say, I am someone who has already done these things, helpful for manifestation and in some other ways too. So sneaky. And so you've shared a bunch of your journey here today, some of your learnings, lessons, speed bumps along the way. Is there anything that you haven't shared that you want listeners to your story in this episode to take away that you haven't said directly?
I don't think so. I feel like we've covered some really good ground. I guess just one more thought around failure and sort of having failures and dealing with them is that I always think about 2 things. One is growth comes outside of your comfort zone. So being uncomfortable is actually a good thing. And then 2, courage is kind of defined as taking action, not when you don't have fear, but taking action with fear. And so those 2 things combined, I think very much underlies a lot of what I see in the coaching that I do, in a lot of the just leadership work that I do, is reminding people that being uncomfortable is a good thing. And that it means that they're growing. And then 2, it's normal to have fear, and it's acting with fear that is actually what is expected, rather than saying like, let's get rid of the fear. I shouldn't have the fear. And then let me go take action. I feel like those 2 are such just powerful motivators to get people to keep going in the time when things are going wrong, things don't feel right, you feel like you're failing. It's okay to be fearful. It's okay to be like uncomfortable. Like that is actually good and like positive and where what you need to grow and be successful.
I love that. The goal isn't no fear. The goal is fear, and I'm going to do it anyways. For folks who are listening that want to connect or learn more about you and what you do, where should we send them? Where are you active online? What channels?
So I'm on LinkedIn. It's just /Yui Zhao. I'm also on Substack. I run a newsletter called The Uncommon Executive, where I write about leadership and career growth and great things. And then I also have a website. It's www.yuizhao.coach, where you can learn more about coaching and working one-on-one with me. And that's the best place to find me.
Cool. We'll put links to all that stuff in the show notes. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you. Great talking with you.